Tutankhamun's spectacular treasures. Now, for the first time since they were discovered, all 5,398 objects are being brought together.
For over a century, the world believed it knew the face of Tutankhamun. 22 pounds of gold, eyes of obsidian that seemed to follow you, a symbol of ancient Egypt itself. But what if everything you thought you knew was a lie? Quantum imaging in 2024 revealed something no one expected. Beneath the surface, the gold had been hammered, scraped, reworked, hiding a secret that collapses the story of the boy king. Was the mask truly his or stolen from another tomb? And who would go to such lengths to erase the truth?
Today marks 100 years since a legendary discovery of King Tut's tomb.
The answers could rewrite everything we know about ancient Egypt. The icon that fooled the world. November 1922. British archaeologist Howard Carter chisels a small opening into a sealed chamber in the Valley of the Kings, holds a candle to the gap, and peers into darkness that has not been disturbed for over 3,000 years. When his colleague Lord Carnarvon asks if he can see anything, Carter whispers what became the most famous words in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. What Carter found inside Tomb Kfi 62 was a treasure hoard beyond anything the modern world had encountered or imagined. Golden chariots, jeweled thrones, painted statues frozen mid-stride, alabaster vessels, gilded furniture, over 5,000 objects representing the full material wealth of a civilization that had mastered beauty the way it mastered engineering, completely and with a precision that still defies easy explanation. But buried deep within 3 nested coffins, each one fitting inside the next like an elaborately constructed Russian doll, I lay the single object that would captivate humanity for the next century, the Golden Death Mask. The ancient Egyptians believed gold was the literal flesh of the gods. Not a metaphor, not a poetic comparison, but a theological statement about the physical substance of divinity. This mask was not a decoration. It was not a commemorative object or a symbol of status. It was sacred technology, engineered with specific purpose, designed to ensure that the pharaoh's soul could recognize its own body in the afterlife and return to it rather than wandering lost for eternity in the darkness between worlds. On the back, craftsmen had carved a protective spell from the Book of the Dead.
The decisive moment in the Egyptian Book of the Dead is called the weighing of the heart.
The ancient Egyptians visualized many challenges waiting for them in the afterlife.
Divine armor for the most dangerous journey any conscious being could undertake. For 100 years, the world accepted this mask as the ultimate masterpiece of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship, flawless, perfect, created specifically for the boy king who died unexpectedly at 19. But almost immediately, experts started noticing things that did not add up. And the genuinely disturbing part is that those things were never hidden. The clues were not buried or obscured or locked away in classified files. They were sitting on the surface of the mask in plain view, visible to anyone who looked carefully enough, for the entire century that the mask sat in its display case in Cairo. The problem was not that the evidence was hard to see. The problem was that seeing it meant accepting something that the entire field of Egyptology had built its identity around denying. The 70-day impossibility. Here is the problem that Egyptologists have been quietly uncomfortable with since the mask was first examined. King Tutankhamun died suddenly, most likely from complications following a severe leg fracture, an injury that would have caused rapid infection in an era before antibiotics, killing a young man who had shown no signs of terminal illness and for whom no preparations had been made. Egyptian religious law was absolute on what happened next. A pharaoh had to be mummified and buried in exactly 70 days, not 69, not 71, 70. This was not a preference or a tradition or a cultural custom that could be stretched when circumstances demanded flexibility. It was a theological imperative, binding as physics, non-negotiable under any circumstances. Now hold that number against what needed to happen in those 70 days. An entire royal tomb needed to be carved from solid limestone. 3 elaborate nested coffins needed to be designed, fabricated, and fitted to each other with the precision of interlocking machinery. Thousands of burial artifacts needed to be gathered, prepared, and arranged according to protocols that governed every object's position relative to every other. And a 22-pound solid gold mask needed to be created from scratch, with microscopic detail work, precious stone inlays, and hand-carved hieroglyphic spells for a death nobody had anticipated and nobody had prepared for. For any single one of those tasks, 70 days would be a demanding timeline. For all of them simultaneously, following an unexpected death, it borders on impossible. And when researchers actually examined the tomb with that pressure in mind, the evidence of extreme haste was everywhere and impossible to dismiss. The tomb itself is embarrassingly small compared to every other royal burial in the Valley of the Kings.
The most famous names, the most important kings of Egypt, we bury in this great cemetery, in this Valley of the Kings.
Cramped, compressed, clearly not designed for a pharaoh, but repurposed when nothing else was available. Some of the wall paintings show signs of incompletion, as though artists were working against a deadline they could not meet. The massive stone sarcophagus has chipped corners, the kind of damage consistent with workers who had to physically break pieces off to force it into a space it was never quite designed to fit. And when researchers examined the burial objects in detail, many of them bore unmistakable evidence of not having been made for Tutankhamun at all. Statues with facial features that matched no known representation of the boy king, jewelry designed for a woman's proportions, coffins with names that had been hastily scraped off and recarved over the erasure. The entire burial was assembled in a scramble, pulling together whatever could be found and modified quickly enough to meet the theological deadline. And then researchers looked at the mask again. Really looked. What they found on the surface, visible, undeniable, and impossible to explain away, was that the mask's ears were pierced. In ancient Egypt, that was not a minor stylistic detail. It was a categorical violation of everything the culture believed about kingship, masculinity, and the sacred function of a burial mask. Only children and women wore earrings. An adult male pharaoh, depicted on the most sacred object of his burial, would never under any circumstances be shown with pierced ears. The lobes of the mask's ears, each shaped slightly differently from the other, bore holes that had no business being there if the mask had been made for the king it was found on. Some researchers also noticed that the face itself looked off in ways that were difficult to articulate precisely, but impossible to unsee once observed. Too delicate, almost feminine in its proportions. And the gold on the face had a subtle reddish tint that differed from the coloration of the headdress, a discrepancy that should not exist if everything had been cast from the same materials at the same time. A theory began to form that was too logical to dismiss and too dangerous to accept. What if when Tutankhamun died,
but only a few years later, he was dead?
There was no mask ready for him. What if the priests racing the 70-day deadline, surrounded by evidence of a burial that had been assembled from whatever came to hand, had grabbed a mask from someone else's tomb and altered it just enough to serve? That raised a question that would haunt the field for decades. Whose face was it originally made for? The vanishing queen. The answer that kept presenting itself was the one the establishment most wanted to avoid. Her name was Nefertiti.
The face of Nefertiti. She was the wife of a pharaoh and the stepmother to another.
You know her face, that famous painted limestone bust with the long neck, the high cheekbones, and the expression of someone who understands exactly what is happening around her and has already calculated her response. She was Tutankhamun's stepmother, chief wife of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, the king who dismantled Egypt's entire religious pantheon and replaced it with worship of a single solar deity, upending thousands of years of theological tradition in a revolution so radical that his successors spent generations systematically erasing every trace of it from the record. When Akhenaten died, something unprecedented may have happened. A growing body of scholarship suggests that Nefertiti did not quietly retire into the background, as royal widows were expected to. She may have seized the throne herself, ruling Egypt as pharaoh under a new name, Neferuaten, commanding an empire, conducting foreign policy, and exercising the full authority of the double crown in a period that the historical record has treated as confused and poorly documented, because the people who came after her worked deliberately to make it so. And then she vanished. No tomb has ever been found. No mummy has been definitively identified. She simply disappears from history with the specific completeness that suggests not natural fading, but active erasure. Someone with the power and the motive to remove her from the record doing exactly that. Here is what made researchers increasingly nervous when they held this history against the evidence of the mask. If Nefertiti died before Tutankhamun, she would have had a burial prepared. A queen who had ruled as pharaoh would have had burial equipment commensurate with that status, including a mask. A mask made for a female ruler would have pierced ears. It would have facial proportions that reflected a woman's features. It would have been made from materials available during her reign. And if Tutankhamun died suddenly, with nothing ready, and his priests were faced with a 70-day deadline, her tomb would have been the most logical and most accessible source of materials that could be modified quickly. The pierced ears made sense. The feminine facial proportions made sense. The evidence of hasty reworking throughout the burial chamber made sense. The entire scrambled, improvised quality of the tomb made sense as the work of people who were not building a burial from scratch, but assembling one from whatever they could find and alter fast enough to serve the purpose. The theory was logical, elegant, and supported by everything visible on the surface of the mask. The only problem was proving it, or actually demonstrating that the mask had been reworked, required looking beneath the gold in ways that the technology of the 20th century could not accomplish, without causing damage nobody was willing to authorize. For decades, the Nefertiti theory remained exactly what it had always been. Whispered about in conference hallways, dismissed by the establishment in published papers, impossible to confirm or deny definitively. Then, in 2014, an accident changed everything. The scan that changed history during a routine cleaning at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo.
A visit to Cairo's Egyptian Museum helps bring the country's many ancient sites to life.
A museum worker accidentally bumped the mask. The long braided beard, a sacred symbol of divine kingship, an object that had survived 33 centuries of human history, snapped clean off. What happened in the immediate aftermath was, in its own way, almost as damaging as the break itself. Instead of contacting specialist conservators and following the established protocols for handling damage to irreplaceable objects, museum staff panicked. They found industrial-strength epoxy, the kind of adhesive used for plumbing repairs, and applied it directly to the surfaces of one of humanity's most significant artifacts, smearing visible glue across the golden chin in their haste to make the problem disappear before anyone noticed. Everyone noticed. The Egyptian government brought in an international restoration team led by German conservator Christian Ekman, whose mandate was to properly repair the damage. But Ekman recognized that before the beard was reattached, he had an opportunity that might never present itself again. Then he would scan the mask with X-ray fluorescence technology, advanced enough to detect chemical differences in the gold's composition, capable of identifying solder lines and structural alterations invisible to the naked eye. His logic was straightforward, and his methodology was sound. If the face had been cut from another mask and joined to this one, the XRF scan would reveal it through mismatched gold compositions, solder residue, or chemical signatures of the heating required to make the attachment. His team spent months scanning every millimeter of the surface. The results appeared definitive. The gold in the face matched the gold in the headdress. The hieroglyphs spelling Tutankhamun's name showed no evidence of being carved over an erased inscription. The delicate glass inlays around the eyes were perfectly intact. And since the heat required to solder a new face would have cracked that glass instantly, their conditions seemed to rule out any face replacement. The mask was declared 100% Tutankhamun's. The Nefertiti theory was pronounced dead. The beard was reattached with beeswax, the mask went back on display, and the history books stayed exactly as they were. But a small group of scientists did not accept the conclusion. Their argument was specific and technically precise. X-ray fluorescence can detect density differences. It can identify cracks, solder joints, and structural discontinuities. but it cannot read the thermal history of metal at the atomic level. It cannot distinguish between gold that was poured once in a single casting and gold that was subsequently reheated, hammered, and reworked by craftsmen skilled enough to eliminate every macroscopic trace of their intervention. To see that history, you would need technology capable of reading the memory stored in the atoms themselves. Technology that, when Ekman's team did their work, did not yet exist outside theoretical physics. By 2024, it did. Dr. Helena Voss is a materials physicist at the Max Planck Institute in Munich, specializing in quantum resonance imaging, a scanning technology so new and so computationally demanding that it exists in only a handful of laboratories worldwide, most of them operating under conditions that limit access to their findings. In late 2024, when her team secured permission from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities to perform a non-invasive scan of the mask. Officially, it was a calibration exercise, a demonstration that their equipment could function accurately on ancient gold without causing damage. They were not expecting to find anything Ekman had missed. The scan took place after the Grand Egyptian Museum closed for the night. The scanner hummed, the mask sat motionless under the beam. Data streamed onto laptops in real time. For hours, the readings confirmed everything already known. Then the scanner focused on the cartouche, the oval frame containing the hieroglyphs of the king's name. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, an Egyptologist from Cairo University who was present that night, said later that the room went dead silent. On the screen, beneath the carved hieroglyphs, the quantum imager was displaying a pattern of atomic displacement that should not exist in an unaltered surface. The gold in that exact location had been hammered, scraped, and reworked through a process found nowhere else on the mask. Someone had beaten the original inscription flat and carved new hieroglyphs over the destruction. Dr. Voss asked her technician to run the scan again. Identical result. She asked him to recalibrate from the beginning. Identical result. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a metallurgist from Kyoto University participating remotely, said she could not process what she was seeing. The data was unambiguous, and then the full structural analysis came back, and the cartouche was no longer the most disturbing finding on the screen. The ghost beneath the gold. The quantum scan dismantled a century of assumptions, one finding at a time, and each finding was more significant than the last. The ears. X-ray fluorescence had shown solid gold where the piercing holes should have been. No gaps, no discontinuities, no evidence of alteration. The quantum scan showed something entirely different. Two perfect cylindrical plugs, fabricated from gold of identical alloy composition to the surrounding metal, inserted into the original holes and then hammered and polished until the seams were reduced to a thickness measurable in atoms rather than millimeters. The ears had been plugged with a precision that no imaging technology available before 2024 could have detected. The mask had originally belonged to someone who wore earrings, the face. The quantum imager detected what Dr. Voss described to her colleagues as thermal ghosting, running along the entire perimeter where the face meets the headdress, a molecular signature indicating that the gold along that precise boundary had been superheated to a different temperature than the surrounding metal on either side of the line. This was not a casting artifact. This was not a natural variation in the cooling process of a single pore. This was the signature of a join, a face that had been cut out of one mask and attached to another using a technique so sophisticated it had remained invisible for 33 centuries. The ancient craftsman had not made the attachment from the front, which would have exposed the glass inlays to the heat required and cracked them instantly. They had done it from behind, applying high-pressure heating to the reverse surface in a way that left the visible front flawless, while leaving the molecular signature of the process embedded in the metal's atomic structure. The seam was completely invisible to X-rays, but the atoms remembered. The face had been cut from a different mask and replaced. The room was silent for a long time after those findings appeared on the screen. Dr. Hassan was the first to speak. He asked whether the scanner's reconstruction algorithm could work backward from the microscopic traces of the original hammering, map the ghostly impressions of the first inscription that had been beaten flat, and digitally rebuild what had once been carved in that location before the erasure. Dr. Voss said yes. She initiated the program. The reconstruction ran for 11 minutes. Nobody spoke. The original hieroglyphs materialized on screen one symbol at a time, assembled from atomic memory, rising out of 3,000 years of deliberate concealment, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. The name was not Tutankhamun. The name was Nefer-Nefer-Uaten, the throne name that historians believe Nefertiti used when she ruled Egypt as pharaoh in her own right. The quantum scan had told the complete story, and the story was exactly what the evidence had been pointing toward for 100 years. When Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, there was no mask prepared for him. His powerful successor, a man named Ai, who likely appropriated the grand tomb originally planned for Tutankhamun for his own burial, left the priests with no options and a 70-day theological deadline that could not be moved. So they went to the tomb of the previous pharaoh, the woman who had ruled as Nefer-Nefer-Uaten, whose burial equipment included a mask of extraordinary craftsmanship, commensurate with her status as a ruling pharaoh. They took her mask, and they went to work with the full resources of the most technically sophisticated civilization on Earth. They plugged her pierced ears with gold from the same batch, hammering until the seams dropped below the threshold of any detection technology they could have imagined existing. They cut out her face and replaced it with a new one bearing the boy king's features, attaching it from behind with heating techniques that left the visible surface indistinguishable from an original casting. They hammered her royal name flat and carved his name over the destruction with enough precision that 3 millennia of examination would find nothing amiss. They buried their king wearing a stolen face, and they buried the truth along with him, wrapped in 22 pounds of gold, sealed in 3 nested coffins, placed inside a tomb, carved in such haste that the sarcophagus's corners had to be chipped off to fit it through the door. The mask sits today in the Grand Egyptian Museum, displayed in a climate-controlled case under carefully calibrated lighting, stared at by millions of visitors every year who believe they are seeing the face of the boy king who died at 19 and was mourned by a civilization. The findings from the 2024 quantum scan have not been officially published. Verification is ongoing. The debates behind closed doors are described by those present as intense, because the careers and reputations built on the existing narrative are substantial, and the institutional resistance to a conclusion, this fundamental, is proportional to how much has been invested in the story being replaced. 3 millennia of gold, secrecy, and deliberate deception have finally been pierced. But if Tutankhamun's mask was stolen and altered, what other truths about Egypt's royal tombs have been hidden beneath layers of time and craft? Where is Nefertiti's true burial mask? And what stories do the artifacts around the world still conceal? The technology that revealed the ghost beneath the gold has only just begun to uncover the past. Are we ready to confront what the centuries have tried to bury and face the full scope of a royal deception that has lasted 3,300 years? Share your theories in the comments and make sure to like the video and subscribe to follow every hidden truth as it comes to light.